Today on our program, we are joined by Shea, Senior Fellow for Peace, Security and Defense at Friends of Europe and former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Jamie, welcome to the studio.
Good morning, Sofia. Thanks for having me back on the show.
I would like to start with a question about Moscow. Recent statements from Moscow suggest a refusal to engage in a serious peace talks. In this, is this a tactical play to wear Ukraine down, or has Putin made a firm decision to fight until he gets terms he considers fully advantageous?
Well, I think President Putin went to Alaska using vague language to sort of make vague promises about future peace talks directly with Zelenskyy and Trump. His interest was, of course, having a good summit in Alaska, avoiding having to make any concessions, particularly avoiding any American sanctions against him, and being welcomed back into the arms of the international community despite his aggression against Ukraine. And I think Putin largely succeeded in that aim. He obviously had a much more successful summit than Trump. And afterwards, we had what we always have. Putin is the man who says nice things but does nothing. And then he allows people like Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, to come in on the back of what he has said and immediately spell out that, in fact, Russia has not changed its position one iota. And Lavrov made that clear in several interviews. Maximalist Russian demands against Ukraine, coming back to this vague notion of removing the root causes of the conflict, which means turning Ukraine into a vassal state. Meantime, Putin sees that he is facing no immediate real pressure from the United States to stop the war. Trump even gave up the idea of an immediate ceasefire in Alaska, and he sees that as long as the summer period continues, he can continue fighting. He's moved, of course, now into the Dnipro province, beyond the Donbass. He's taking big losses, but I think he honestly feels that for the time being, he's under no pressure to negotiate or make concessions. He can carry on the war and try to seize more Ukrainian territory.
Indeed, and you know that not only Russian conditions isn't changed, but also the question about President Zelensky's legitimacy are growing louder in Russia. U.S. President Donald Trump has publicly urged the Ukrainian side basically to ignore these claims, and I would like to show the video of his recent statement about it.
I have a question for Steve Witkoff, if I may.
Yeah.
This past weekend, Sergei Lavrov was saying that Putin will not sign a peace deal with Zelenskyy because Russia views him as illegitimate. I'm just wondering if the Russians have been relaying this to your team, if they view Zelenskyy, as a leader worth signing a peace deal with. If they will.
Doesn't matter what they say. Steve can answer, but I can answer too. Doesn't matter what they say. Everybody's posturing. It's all bullshit, okay? Everybody's posturing. Steve, do you have a different answer?
I agree with you, sir.
What's your reaction to the statement?
Well, first of all, I don't always agree with everything that President Trump says. That's well known. But I do agree with him on this one, because clearly President Zelenskyy is the legitimate leader of Ukraine. The Ukrainian constitution makes clear that elections, as you know better than I do, Sofia, cannot be held in wartime conditions because there is a state of emergency, of course, in Ukraine. And President Zelenskyy has made it clear that once there is a peace, those elections will be organized. So he is a legitimate leader, and it's really good that President Trump has not sort of succumbed to the Russian propaganda on this. Putin is using this notion of Zelenskyy's legitimacy as an excuse to postpone meeting him and engaging in serious peace negotiations. But there's another factor as well. The more Putin can pretend that Zelenskyy is not legitimate, the more he can question the validity and the legality of any agreement that he might sign with Zelenskyy Zelensky. And if, in Putin's view, the future Ukrainian leader in a Russian vassal state is a kind of Putin stooge, he can then say that he's going to negotiate another agreement with that Ukrainian leader, much more on his terms, which would further reduce Ukraine's independence. So I think that this is clearly, yes, posturing. Trump is right by Putin and the Russians, and it's good that at least on this one, Trump and the Americans are pushing back firmly.
Indeed, but the U.S. and according to Trump's statement, the U.S. urged Ukraine to ignore Russia's demands. But yet, the same day, Trump basically did another statement, hints at potential economic pressure if the war drags on. Does this risk Ukraine being partially blamed for any failure or delay in peace talks? And how can Kyiv avoid falling into that trap?
Well, it's not easy, let's be honest, for Kiev and Zelensky. A bad visit to the White House in February, a very good visit to the White House with the European leaders a few days ago. Frankly, since the beginning of the Trump administration, we've seen this kind of carousel or seesaw in American positions. One day, going much further towards Putin, the next day more towards the Ukrainian European position. And frankly, this sort of, the glass is half full, the glass is half empty. There is positive, there is less positive. It's just something I think we are having to sort of get used to in the US-Ukraine relationship, and to deal with the best we can. On the good side, the United States has now committed to security guarantees for Ukraine after a peace settlement. And in recent days, Sofia, we've had more detail about the exact sort of contribution that the Americans are willing to make to a security presence, a security force in Ukraine. That's good. We've had Trump agreeing to supply weapons to Ukraine, albeit at a price and via NATO, but still no longer a freeze on US arms supplies. We've had, of course, the Trump sanctions on India for its trade with Russia in oil, and so on. On the bad side, unfortunately, yes, Trump has given up the notion of pushing for a ceasefire, as I said a moment ago. Number two, we've heard from the Pentagon in recent days that they've put restrictions on the ability of Ukraine to use long-range US missiles and artillery to strike Russian targets, which of course is a key priority for Ukraine at the moment, particularly in striking the Russian energy complex. So yes, it's always 50-50, 60-40, 40-60. But the key thing for Ukraine and the Europeans is to keep the United States locked in to the achievements of the Washington summit when it comes to security guarantees and pressure, of course, on Putin to accept a summit as well, and to keep the US supply of weapons flowing to Ukraine. As long as Trump does not go back on these commitments, we are nonetheless moving forward, albeit too slowly.
Talking about security guarantees, Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, has suggested a model of security guarantees for Ukraine similar to NATO's Article 5 commitments. How realistic is this framework, and could it genuinely deter further Russian aggression?
Well, certainly not if it's just a piece of paper. Let's be clear about that, because we know Putin doesn't take pieces of paper, even with his signature on them, very seriously. So an Article 5 security guarantee in NATO means more than just a paper guarantee. It means troops on the ground, like you have NATO forces in Eastern Europe deployed on borders, ready to defend the territory immediately if there is an attack. For instance, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was visiting the Canadian troops in Latvia in the recent days, and you saw there that there are 14 NATO countries in Latvia under Canadian command, NATO command too, defending that territory. So it's all very well for the Italians to talk about Article 5 security guarantees. It sounds good, but it does not detract from what the French and the British are trying to do with the coalition of the willing, which is to make sure that it's a firm, hard security guarantee by having the presence of NATO countries on the ground inside Ukraine to implement a peace agreement, basically training, of course, the Ukrainian army, training, equipping the Ukrainian army in Ukraine itself, but also, of course, ensuring Ukraine's air defense, providing Ukraine with intelligence, implementing a no-fly zone, of course, for Russian aircraft, and also policing and patrolling the Black Sea, very important, so that Ukraine is able to use the Black Sea for its economic activity. So, you know, as always, it sounds good, but the devil is in the detail. But if it's an alternative for what the French and British are trying to do with the idea of a reassurance force on the ground in Ukraine, then it's not, I don't think, something that we really need. We need hard security guarantees, not vague promises.
But do you see a scenario where after a peace agreement, I'm not talking about the US, but other allies, probably European allies, might deploy troops on the ground in Ukraine? And what kind of role could it be? Defensive, or you just see it as a training, or potentially broader this role could be?
Well, it's a great question, and we still don't know, you know, Sofia, because as a journalist you've been covering this, there've been, you know, a multitude of these meetings of the coalition of the willing, or the so-called Ramstein group, the Ukraine Contact Group. There's another meeting in London of the Ukraine Contact Group on September the 9th. These are all of the NATO allies, plus Australia, plus Japan, that have expressed a willingness to contribute to these security guarantees. But although there's a lot of planning, and I understand that the military chiefs of the coalition countries have presented their political leaders now with different options, different alternative scenarios, we still don't have a concrete plan yet, and we probably won't have, frankly, until a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia, an effective one, is concluded. But what we can see is that there will be a relatively small European presence on the ground, essentially led by the UK and France, which will, yes, concentrate on training the Ukrainian army, equipping the Ukrainian army, but which will also be robust enough to protect itself. It will have heavy equipment. And of course, the Russians will always have the problem at the back of their heads that if they attack Ukraine, they will probably also be attacking this European force. And then that could lead to escalation, which of course is not something that Putin, I think, would be seeking. But the other aspects, which I mentioned a moment ago, are key, is to obviously to prevent the Russians using Ukrainian airspace for drone attacks, for ballistic missile attacks, for the penetration of aircraft, a no-fly zone, which would stop the kind of Russian strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, Ukrainian civilians that we've been seeing. And then, of course, this maritime demining presence in the Black Sea. The US has usefully come in with the offer now to provide air defense, to provide aircraft, to provide space-based intelligent assets, to provide command and control. The problem at the moment, the way I see it, Sofia, is that a number of European countries have said they're willing to contribute, but not many have said that they are willing to have forces on the ground. For example, Romania yesterday said no troops on the ground, but maybe ships in the Black Sea. So we see more willingness to contribute to the air and maritime component. But of course, there has to be a ground presence too. And I think the task for the UK and France is to persuade more NATO member states to contribute to those forces on the ground as well in coming weeks.
Former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen recently said Ukraine's NATO membership shouldn't be discussed with Putin and should be discussed only between Ukraine and NATO. Do you agree with this statement? And with Russia refusing foreign troops in Ukraine, is there any point in negotiating security guarantees with Moscow?
The answer to the second part of your question, security guarantees from Moscow, absolutely not, because Lavrov was clear last week that the way Russia sees those security guarantees is that it's all in the hands of the UN Security Council, where Russia and China would have a veto, and the NATO countries would not be able to implement any provisions on the ground. No NATO troops on the ground. It would be paper guarantees. It would be back to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which you recall guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty at the time, and which Russia has torn up on at least two occasions in 2014 and 2022. So no, that's not a security guarantee that anybody would have any particular faith in, given particularly Putin's behavior as a serial violator of written agreements. I mean, there's an American research institute that calculates that Russia has violated over 130 international agreements since invading Ukraine. And we learned this week that the Russian Prime Minister is now recommending that Moscow also withdraw from the International Convention Against Torture and so on. So no, Russia cannot be involved in the definition of these security guarantees. That is something which Ukraine and its Western allies have to agree among themselves. Of course, the other part about NATO membership, which my old boss at NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, mentioned, is that this is also something for NATO to decide and Ukraine. It's the right of every country in Europe under international law to join an alliance if that country so wishes. And that is a principle, by the way, that Russia also agreed to back in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe after the end of the Cold War. And if NATO gives Russia a veto over NATO policy and NATO decisions, that means that NATO is no longer NATO. NATO loses its freedom of maneuver and sovereignty. And if Russia questions the legitimacy of NATO enlargement to Ukraine, it questions the legitimacy of all of the enlargements to Central and Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, etc., which NATO has carried out since 1999. So this would not only be bad for Ukraine, it would be bad for the Central and Eastern Europeans, because then you would see a Russian campaign already started to try to push NATO forces out of the territory of those former communist states in Central and Eastern Europe as well. So this would be bad for Ukraine, but also very, very, very bad for the credibility of NATO.
If Moscow is deliberately delaying negotiations, as we see now, what combination of military and non-military tools could Ukraine use in coming years to shift Russia's calculations? It could be deep strikes, energy infrastructure, naval operations, border pressure. What should take a priority?
Well, the key thing is to help Ukraine to do the things that Ukraine does well already, to build on its strengths. And then, of course, in a longer term, to try to remedy some of the weaknesses. I mean, you're right. At the moment, the strength of Ukraine are these long-range strikes against the Russian oil energy facilities. I mean, for example, gasoline prices in Moscow today or in St. Petersburg are much higher because 17% of the Russian refinery capacity has been taken out of operation through these Ukrainian drone strikes. So that is having an effect, and that pressure has to be maintained to make it harder for Russia to finance and to sustain the war. The second thing, of course, is Ukraine has had a great deal of success with these sabotage operations and intelligence operations deep inside Russia, destroying, for example, strategic bombers on Russian airfields far away as Siberia. The third thing is to help Ukraine with its drone production, of course, particularly long-range drones, the development of the long-range cruise missile that President Zelenskyy, the Flamengo, unveiled this week, to move defense production to Ukraine itself, as German companies, Danish companies, Norwegian companies, and some American companies are doing as well, because that's quicker and cheaper than supplying weapons from from Western stocks too. Counter-drone technology, particularly against the fiber optic drones that Russia is using at the moment. And also NATO is now doing a lot of work with Ukraine on technologies to shoot down the Russian glide bombs, which are devastating against civilian targets. Further afield, more air defense systems. So it's good that this week we've had indications from Germany, from Norway, about more Patriot air defense systems being sent to Ukraine, ammunition to make sure that the Ukrainians defending in the Donbass are able to maintain a heavy rate of fire against Russian advances, to stop further Russian advances. And then, of course, Sofia, in the long run, naturally, more pressure on Moscow through economic sanctions. It would be good if the US Congress could approve an authority to the president to impose sanctions on Russia, so that Trump has all of the legal instruments in place, should he decide, as I hope he will, to impose those greater oil and financial sanctions against Moscow. So there's a lot to be done. Of course, the weakness is the Ukrainian manpower problem, the retention of manpower to stop the desertion rate in the Ukrainian army. That can't be remedied overnight, but that's where at least technology can help to compensate for manpower deficiencies until the recruitment and training issue in the Ukrainian army can be remedied.
If the war turns into a prolonged frozen conflict, what would this mean for Europe's political architecture? I'm talking about both the EU and NATO. Could this basically repeat historical patterns like those seen in Czechoslovakia in the last century?
Well, I'm an academic historian by training, and if I look at Czechoslovakia, the Munich conference in September 1938, the big mistake that the French and the British made at the time was believing in the words of Hitler. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, came back to the UK with a piece of paper with Hitler's signature and proclaimed peace in our time. 6 months later, in March 1939, Hitler had occupied all of the Czechoslovakia in defiance of the Munich Agreement. And of course, then he went on to invade Poland on the 1st of September 1939. So no, first conclusion is don't conclude paper agreements with dictators and believe that their signature has any weight. The second thing, Sofia, with the frozen conflicts, you know, the Minsk processes, the Normandy processes with Ukraine, with Georgia, with Azerbaijan, Armenia, with Moldova, they were basically trusted negotiations that went nowhere. And of course, the lesson I think that NATO has learned, and NATO leaders have acknowledged this, after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, was to carry on negotiating and not simultaneously arm Ukraine. If we had given Ukraine after 2014 the training, the weapons, the assistance, the political support that we gave them after 2022, the second Russian invasion, probably Putin would not have invaded Ukraine. The Ukrainian army would have simply been too strong. So if, yes, we have to accept another sort of frozen conflict situation in eastern Ukraine, which at least stops the war and stops the killing, it has to go alongside this massive rearmament, retraining program. In other words, whether there's a peace agreement or not with Russia, NATO has to be involved in the training, equipment and arming of the Ukrainian army to deter further Russian land grabs, at least freeze the situation until some meaningful peace formula, hopefully with a post-Putin Russia, can take place.
How vulnerable would Central and Eastern Europe become in this scenario of a frozen war? Does it increase the risk of renewed aggression against not only Ukraine but neighboring states?
Well, that's a great question. And I think, obviously, you know, when the war ends, you know, whatever the political outcome, the Russian army will, of course, have taken a beating. You know, the Ukrainians have inflicted a severe beating on the Russian army, you know, over 1 million dead and casualties, massive thousands of tanks, armored vehicles destroyed. Obviously, the Russian war industry has been hit, as we were talking about earlier. So I don't think Russia is going to be in a situation where it would be able to immediately simply sort of carry on, even if it were successful in Ukraine, to attack a NATO country. It would need time to sort of rebuild, to reconstitute, to reform. So NATO, I think, would continue to enjoy some kind of breathing space. For how long, we don't know, 5 years, 10 years, nobody really knows, to build up its own forces, of course. But there's no doubt that Russian troops on the border between Ukraine and the West, not at the moment only in the east, that would be a very worrying, alarming scenario for NATO, which would obviously push defense spending and NATO's own military build-up even higher. It can't be, peace under those terms can't be good news. Putin would be encouraged to believe that aggression wins. But I think in the short run, what we would see would be a continuation of this Russian attempt to divide the West, woo the United States, split the EU, split NATO, carry on, all of these hybrid warfare attacks. In recent days, we've seen a Russian cyber attack against a dam in Norway. Finland has put on trial Russians involved in cutting telecommunications cables in the Baltic Sea. We've seen Russian sabotage attempts in the Baltic states, in Poland, in the UK. Lots and lots of activities to try to really play on our own political divisions, to soften us up, if you like, for an ultimate Russian military aggression. And that's, I think, it's happening already. But I think in the wake of the end of the Ukrainian war, Russia will certainly try to sort of accelerate those kind of operations, which are still, as far as Russia are concerned, cheap. We're a target-rich environment, unfortunately, and we don't respond as vigorously to those sort of attacks as we would respond against a full-scale Russian military invasion.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation and for your interesting insights.
As always, a pleasure. And again, all the best for Ukraine, and keep the resistance going. Thank you for the opportunity.
If you like this video, please subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments.